If one day you were allowed to stand before a piece of cloth that many believe once wrapped the body of Jesus Christ, if you could look upon a crown of thorns said to have rested on his head, and if you knew that somewhere in the world there are still nails believed to have pierced his hands and feet, how much would you believe? Perhaps that question is not really about history. It reaches into something deeper, the fragile boundary between what can be proven and what can only be felt. If stories like this make you think, consider subscribing and following the channel to explore more mysteries where history, faith, and human nature intersect. Our journey begins with a piece of cloth, silent, aged, and yet carrying a mystery that has never been fully resolved, the Shroud of Turin. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than an old linen fabric. But as your eyes adjust, an image slowly emerges, faint, almost ghost-like, yet undeniably human. The full figure of a man, front and back, imprinted onto the cloth. The details are unsettling. Wounds at the wrists and feet that resemble crucifixion marks, long streaks across the back, as if from repeated scourging, and around the head, patterns that suggest something sharp once pressed deeply into the skin, like thorns. These details align with the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, with a precision that feels almost too exact to dismiss. Yet what truly sets the cloth apart is not just the image, but how that image exists. There is no paint, no ink, no trace of any known artistic method. And then, in 1898, something extraordinary happened. When the cloth was photographed for the first time, the negative image revealed a face with startling clarity, depth, contour, expression, almost lifelike. It was as if the cloth itself functioned as a natural photographic negative, centuries before photography even existed. Scientists have tried to explain it. Some suggest a chemical reaction between a body and the linen. Others propose heat, radiation, or some unknown burst of energy. But no experiment has ever successfully reproduced all the characteristics of the image, its superficial depth, its precision, its negative properties. Then came carbon dating, one of the most trusted scientific methods for determining age. The results pointed to the Middle Ages, long after the time of Jesus. But almost immediately, the findings were challenged. Critics argued that the tested sample may have come from a section repaired after a fire, contaminating the results. And so, once again, everything returned to uncertainty. No final answer, only more questions. If the cloth leaves us wondering about the reality of death, the Crown of Thorns brings us closer to the reality of suffering. According to the Gospel narratives, before the crucifixion, Jesus was mocked by soldiers who placed a crown made of sharp thorns upon his head, a cruel parody of kingship. Over the centuries, many have believed that this crown still exists. Part of it has long been preserved at Notre Dame Cathedral, where it has been revered as a sacred relic. But what remains today does not match the dramatic image many imagine. The thorns themselves are gone. What survives is a circular band, what is believed to be the base that once held them. So, where did the thorns go? They were not lost. Instead, they are said to have been separated and distributed across Europe. Different churches claim to hold individual thorns, each treated as a fragment of something sacred. And from this, a difficult question emerges. Do all these thorns truly come from the same crown? During the medieval period, relics held immense spiritual and social power. A single sacred object could attract pilgrims, elevate the status of a church, even influence entire regions. In such a context, it is not hard to imagine relics being divided or even replicated to extend their presence. But whether authentic or not, the crown represents something that transcends physical verification. It embodies suffering, visible, imaginable, and deeply human. Then there are the nails. Small, cold pieces of metal, yet tied to one of the most brutal moments in the story. According to tradition, crucifixion required 3 or 4 nails, and yet today, more than that number are claimed to exist as holy relics. Some are preserved in prominent churches, brought out only on special occasions. Each carries its own history, its own narrative. But when all these claims are considered together, a paradox appears. If only a few nails were used, why are there so many? Perhaps they were divided over time. Perhaps some objects are indirectly connected, metal believed to have been forged from the original nails, or items that came into contact with them and were later venerated. Or perhaps, somewhere along the centuries, stories expanded, transformed, multiplied, and once again we find ourselves facing uncertainty. At this point, a deeper question begins to take shape. Are we truly searching for historical truth, or are we trying to reinforce what we already believe? Science and faith often seem to move along parallel paths. Science demands evidence, measurable, testable, repeatable. Faith, on the other hand, does not depend on such criteria. It is built on experience, tradition, and meaning. Human beings naturally want to see in order to believe. A cloth, a thorn, a nail, these objects become tangible bridges to something intangible. They bring the distant past closer, making the abstract feel real. But what if one day science definitively proves that one of these relics is not authentic? Would faith collapse? Probably not. Because at its core, faith is not constructed upon any single object. Relics may enhance emotional connection. They may make a story more vivid. But they are not the foundation. If anything, they function more like doors. They open a passage into a deeper space, one where people reflect, question, and connect with something beyond themselves. But once you step through that door, what keeps you there is not the door itself, but what you experience within. So perhaps the real question is no longer whether these objects are true or false. Instead, it becomes something more profound. What makes something sacred? Is it the object itself, or the meaning we give it? In the end, the journey through the shroud, the crown, and the nails is not just an exploration of relics. It is an exploration of human nature, how we believe, how we doubt, and how we search for meaning in a world that does not always provide clear answers. And maybe the most sacred thing is not something you can touch, not the cloth, not the thorns, not the nails, but the feeling they awaken, the sense of connection, the spark of belief, and the question that remains unanswered. Because sometimes it is the search itself that gives everything its meaning. If the shroud leaves us standing at the edge of death's mystery, then the crown of thorns pulls us into something far more immediate: pain. Not abstract pain, not distant suffering told through words, but something almost tangible, something the human mind can picture but never fully endure. In the Gospel accounts, before the crucifixion, Jesus is surrounded by soldiers. They do not simply prepare him for execution, they mock him. They take a cluster of thorny branches, twist them into the shape of a crown, and press it down onto his head. It is not just an act of cruelty, it is theatre, a performance of humiliation, a king crowned not with gold, but with thorns. This moment matters, not only because of the physical agony it represents, but because of what it symbolizes. Pain alone can break the body, but humiliation reaches deeper. It attempts to strip away identity, dignity, meaning. The crown of thorns is not merely an instrument of torture, it is a statement, a declaration that the one wearing it is being reduced, ridiculed, denied. And yet, over time, that very object, created to mock, has been transformed into something sacred. For centuries, people have believed that this crown still exists in some form. Its most well-known association is with Notre Dame Cathedral, where a relic identified as part of the crown has been preserved and venerated. It has been carried in processions, protected through wars, and regarded as one of the most significant relics in Christian tradition. But when we move past the idea and look at the object itself, something unexpected appears. The crown, as it exists today, does not resemble the image most people hold in their minds. There are no sharp thorns encircling it, no jagged spikes radiating outward. What remains is a simple circular band, a woven ring, believed to be the base onto which the thorns were once attached. The absence is striking. It immediately raises a question that cannot be ignored. Where did the thorns go? The answer, according to historical tradition, is that they did not disappear. They were separated, carefully removed, piece by piece, and distributed across different parts of Europe. Churches, monasteries, and religious institutions came to possess individual thorns, each treated as a sacred relic in its own right. And so, instead of one crown, there are many fragments. Instead of a single object, there is a network of objects, scattered, multiplied, each carrying a claim to the same origin. At first glance, this might seem like preservation, a way of protecting something fragile by dividing it. But the more one thinks about it, the more complicated it becomes. If there are dozens of thorns, perhaps more, each believed to be part of the original crown, then a difficult question emerges. Can they all be authentic? Or have some of them been created, replicated, or simply assigned meaning over time? This is where history begins to blur. During the medieval period, relics were not only spiritual objects, they were also sources of influence. A church that possessed a sacred relic could attract pilgrims from distant lands. These pilgrims brought not only devotion, but also economic and social significance. Entire cities could grow around the presence of a single revered object. In such a world, the line between preservation and expansion was not always clear. It was not uncommon for relics to be divided, shared, or even duplicated in some form. Sometimes this was done with genuine reverence, a belief that spreading the relic allowed more people to connect with the sacred. Other times it may have been driven by less pure motives, the desire for recognition, power, or stability. And so, the Crown of Thorns becomes more than just a relic. It becomes a case study in how human societies interact with the idea of the sacred. There are, broadly speaking, two possibilities. The first is that the crown is authentic, that it truly dates back to the events described in the Gospels. If that is the case, then its fragmentation could be understood as a natural consequence of history. Over centuries, objects are moved, divided, and redistributed. What we see today would then be the scattered remains of something once whole. The second possibility is more complex, that at least some of these relics are not original, but were created later, objects that gained meaning not through direct connection, but through belief, tradition, and acceptance. In this scenario, authenticity becomes less about origin and more about perception. But perhaps the most important insight lies beyond both of these possibilities. Because even if we were able to trace every thorn, analyze every fragment, and arrive at a definitive answer, true or false, it would not fully resolve what the crown represents. Its power does not come solely from its material. It comes from what it evokes. The Crown of Thorns is, at its core, a symbol of suffering willingly endured. It represents a moment where pain and humiliation were not avoided, but accepted. And that idea, more than any physical object, has echoed across centuries. In a strange way, the fragmentation of the crown may even enhance this symbolism. Each thorn, separated and carried to a different place, becomes a point of connection. A reminder that the story it represents is not confined to a single location, a single artifact, or even a single interpretation. It spreads, it adapts, it lives in the spaces between certainty and belief. And this leads us to a deeper question, one that extends beyond the crown itself. Why do humans feel the need to preserve objects associated with suffering? Why do we hold on to these fragments of pain and elevate them into symbols of meaning? Perhaps it is because suffering, when seen from a distance, is difficult to grasp. Words can describe it, but they often fail to convey its weight. A physical object, however, a thorn, a piece of cloth, a fragment of metal, gives form to something otherwise intangible. It allows us to engage with the past not just intellectually, but emotionally. To stand before such an object is to feel, even if only faintly, the reality it represents. But that feeling does not depend entirely on authenticity. It depends on recognition, on the human ability to look at something and understand what it stands for. In that sense, the Crown of Thorns is no longer just an artifact. It becomes a narrative, a story continuously retold, reshaped, and reinterpreted. Whether whole or divided, original or replicated, it carries forward an idea that transcends its physical form. An idea of sacrifice, of endurance, of meaning found within suffering. And perhaps that is why, even after centuries of debate, uncertainty, and fragmentation, the crown has not lost its significance, because its true essence was never confined to the thorns themselves. It exists in what they have come to represent, and in the way that representation continues to resonate within the human experience. If the Crown of Thorns carries the weight of humiliation and visible suffering, then the nails take us to the final, irreversible moment, the point where pain is no longer symbolic, but absolute. Cold iron meeting flesh. The instant where a life is fixed, quite literally, to a piece of wood. In the Christian narrative, the crucifixion stands at the center of everything. And within that moment, the nails are not just tools, they are instruments of finality. They mark the transition from suffering to death, from endurance to completion. Yet, like the crown and the shroud before it, the story of these nails does not remain simple. It begins in the 4th century, during a time when the Roman Empire itself was undergoing transformation. Christianity, once persecuted, was becoming institutionalized. And within this shift, a figure emerges whose role would shape the trajectory of relic history: Helena. According to tradition, Helena undertook a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in search of sacred sites connected to the life of Jesus. During this journey, she is said to have discovered several significant relics, including the true cross and the nails used in the crucifixion. Whether viewed as historical fact or layered tradition, this moment becomes foundational. From here, the narrative of the holy nails begins to spread outward, geographically, culturally, and symbolically. Over time, these relics were transported to important centers of Christianity. Some were preserved, others displayed, and many became deeply embedded within the identity of the places that housed them. Today, several locations claim to possess one of these nails. Among the most notable are Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem and Milan Cathedral. Each site presents its relic with reverence, often limiting public exposure to specific ceremonies or significant religious occasions. To stand before such an object is to stand before something that claims direct contact with one of the most defining moments in religious history. But almost immediately, a problem emerges. Crucifixion, as understood historically, typically required 3 or 4 nails, 2 for the hands or wrists, and 1 or 2 for the feet. The mechanics of the execution method are relatively well studied, and while variations may have existed, the number of nails used would not have been large. And yet, across Europe and beyond, more than that number of nails have been identified, venerated, and preserved as authentic relics. This is where the paradox takes shape. If only a few nails were used, how can so many exist? The question is not merely numerical. It strikes at the heart of historical continuity and authenticity. It forces us to confront the possibility that not all claims can be simultaneously true, or at least not in the literal sense. Several explanations have been proposed, each attempting to reconcile the contradiction without fully dismissing the tradition. One possibility is fragmentation. Just as with the Crown of Thorns, the nails themselves may have been divided over time. Metal can be broken, reshaped, or distributed into smaller pieces. A single nail, in theory, could give rise to multiple relics, each containing a portion of the original material. Another explanation involves association. Not every object labeled as a holy nail may have been one of the actual nails used in the crucifixion. Some may be objects connected indirectly, metal believed to have been forged from the original nails, or items that were brought into contact with them and later elevated in status. Over time, the distinction between direct and indirect connection could blur, especially within traditions that prioritize meaning over strict material lineage. There is also the possibility of replication, intentional or otherwise. In a medieval context where relics carried immense spiritual and social value, the creation or attribution of additional relics cannot be entirely ruled out. Whether driven by devotion, misunderstanding, or institutional motives, such processes could have contributed to the multiplication of objects associated with the same origin. Each of these explanations offers a way to understand the paradox, but none of them resolves it completely. And perhaps that is the point. Because the deeper we look into the history of these nails, the more we begin to realize that the issue is not just about quantity, it is about the nature of historical memory itself. History, especially when transmitted across centuries, is not a perfectly preserved record. It is a layered construction, shaped by retelling, interpretation, and the needs of those who carry it forward. Objects become anchors for these narratives, but they do not always remain unchanged. They move, they transform, they accumulate meaning. In that sense, each nail, regardless of its origin, represents more than a physical artifact. It represents a story, a trajectory, a point where belief and history intersect. From a strictly scientific perspective, the situation remains unresolved. There is no definitive list of authentic nails, no universally accepted verification, no conclusive evidence that can confirm or deny every claim. But from a human perspective, the question shifts. Why do these nails matter so much? Is it because they provide physical proof of a historical event? Or is it because they allow us to connect, in some tangible way, to a moment that would otherwise remain distant and abstract? A piece of metal, by itself, is ordinary. But when placed within a narrative, when linked to suffering, sacrifice, and meaning, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a focal point, a way of holding on to something that cannot be fully grasped through words alone. And perhaps this is why the paradox persists without diminishing the significance of the nails. Their value does not depend solely on their number or even on their authenticity. It lies in their role as connectors between past and present, between event and interpretation, between what is known and what is believed. In the end, we are left not with a clear answer, but with a deeper understanding of the question itself. There is no precise count, no absolute confirmation, no final resolution, only a collection of objects, each carrying its own claim, its own history, its own meaning. And beyond them, a continuing human effort to make sense of something that resists being fully explained. Because just like the shroud, and just like the crown, the nails do not simply point backward to a single moment in time. They point inward, to the way we remember, the way we interpret, and the way we seek truth in a world where certainty is often just out of reach. After the shroud, the crown, and the nails, a pattern begins to emerge, not in the objects themselves, but in the way we respond to them. Each relic pulls us into the same tension. Each one invites us to ask the same question in a different form. And slowly, almost without noticing, we arrive at the center of it all, the quiet but persistent conflict between science and faith. It is not a conflict defined by hostility, but by difference, two fundamentally different ways of understanding the world. Science operates through structure. It requires clarity, precision, and discipline. For something to be accepted, it must be measured, observed, and tested. Not once, but repeatedly. A result must be reproducible, verifiable by others, independent of belief or expectation. In this framework, truth is not declared, it is demonstrated. When science looks at the shroud, it asks, what is the material composition? How was the image formed? can the process be recreated? When it examines the crown, it asks, where are the thorns? What is the botanical origin? What is the chain of custody? And when it turns to the nails, it asks, how many could have existed? What metallurgy supports their age? Can their provenance be confirmed? These are not cynical questions. They are necessary ones, designed to separate assumption from evidence. And yet, again and again, the answers remain incomplete. The data exists, but it does not converge. The hypotheses are plausible, but not definitive. Each attempt at resolution seems to open another layer of uncertainty. From the scientific perspective, this places the relics in a category that is both intriguing and frustrating. Unresolved phenomena. Not proven, not disproven, simply not fully explained. Faith, however, does not approach the question in the same way. Faith does not begin with measurement. It begins with meaning. It is built not on what can be tested, but on what can be experienced. It draws strength from continuity, stories passed down through generations, traditions preserved across centuries, symbols that carry emotional and spiritual weight far beyond their physical form. Where science asks, is this object authentic? Faith asks, what does this object represent? And that distinction changes everything. To a scientific observer, a relic is an artifact to be analyzed. To a believer, it is a point of connection, a tangible link to something sacred, something that transcends the material world. Neither perspective is inherently wrong. They are simply operating within different systems. And this is where the tension arises, because when science cannot confirm something, it withholds judgment. It remains cautious, provisional. But faith does not require confirmation to persist. It continues, even in the absence of certainty. This difference can feel like a contradiction, but it may be closer to a divergence. Human beings, by nature, exist somewhere between these two modes of understanding. We want to know, but we also want to believe. There is a deeply rooted instinct within us, the desire to see in order to believe. Abstract ideas can inspire, but they often feel distant. A story can move us, but a physical object can anchor that emotion in reality. This is where relics take on their unique role. A piece of cloth, a fragment of thorn, a piece of iron. Individually, they are ordinary materials. But when placed within a narrative, they become something more. They become bridges, connecting the visible to the invisible, the present to the past, the known to the unknown. To stand before such an object is not just to observe it, it is to experience a kind of proximity. The distance between now and then seems to shrink, if only for a moment, and that experience can be powerful. But it also leads to a difficult question, one that cannot be avoided forever. What happens if that bridge is broken? What happens if science at some point provides clear and undeniable evidence that a particular relic is not authentic, not ancient, not original, not what it has been believed to be? Would faith collapse? At first, it might seem like the answer should be yes. If belief is tied to an object, and that object is proven false, then belief itself should weaken. But reality is more complex, because faith, in its deepest form, is not constructed upon a single piece of evidence. It does not rest entirely on a cloth, or a crown, or a nail. Those objects may support it, they may reinforce it, they may make it more tangible, but they are not its foundation. The foundation lies elsewhere, in interpretation, in meaning, in the internal frameworks through which individuals understand the world. If a relic is shown to be inauthentic, it may alter the way a story is told. It may change the relationship between object and narrative, but it does not necessarily erase the narrative itself. The story remains, the symbolism remains. The values associated with that story, sacrifice, endurance, redemption, remain. In some cases, faith may even adapt. It may shift its focus away from the object and toward what the object was meant to represent. What was once seen as literal may become metaphorical. what was once external may become internal, and in doing so, it continues. This does not mean that evidence is irrelevant, nor does it mean that questions should not be asked. On the contrary, the presence of questions is what drives both science and faith forward, albeit in different ways. Science seeks answers through investigation, faith seeks meaning through reflection, and perhaps the tension between them is not something to be resolved, but something to be understood, because in that tension, something uniquely human is revealed. We are not purely rational beings, nor are we purely symbolic ones. We exist in the space between. We build systems of knowledge, and we build systems of belief. Sometimes they align, sometimes they diverge, but both are part of the same effort to make sense of existence. The relics we have explored, the shroud, the crown, the nails, do not simply challenge our understanding of history. They challenge our understanding of how we know anything at all. What counts as proof, what counts as meaning, and which of those matters more. There may never be a final answer, but perhaps that is what gives the question its enduring power. Because as long as the question remains open, the search continues. And within that search, whether guided by data or by belief, we come closer not only to the truth of the objects, but to the truth of ourselves. After moving through the shroud, the crown, the nails, and the quiet tension between science and faith, something begins to shift. The question is no longer just about objects, or even about history. It becomes something more internal, more reflective, something philosophical. Because at some point, the investigation turns inward. We begin to ask not only what these relics are, but why they matter to us at all. And that is where the nature of the sacred comes into focus. It is tempting to think that sacredness resides within the object itself, that a piece of cloth becomes holy because of what touched it, that a thorn becomes meaningful because of where it once rested, that a nail becomes significant because of what it once pierced. But the deeper we look, the less stable that assumption becomes. Objects by themselves are neutral. Linen is linen, wood is wood, metal is metal. Their physical properties do not change simply because a story is attached to them. What changes is the way we perceive them. The sacred, then, may not be an inherent quality of the object. It may be something assigned, something constructed, not artificially but meaningfully, through human interpretation. This does not make it less real. It makes it differently real. Because meaning is not something we discover in objects. It is something we create in relationship to them. A relic becomes sacred not only because of its possible origin, but because of what it comes to represent over time. Memory accumulates around it. Stories gather. Emotions attach themselves. Generations pass those associations forward, reinforcing and reshaping them along the way. And slowly, the object becomes more than itself. But this leads to an important realization. If the sacred is not confined to the material, then the material is not the final destination. It is a starting point, a threshold, a doorway. Relics, in this sense, are not endpoints of belief. They are entry points into it. They invite us to step closer, to engage, to reflect. But they are not meant to contain the entirety of what they point toward. A door is valuable because it allows passage. But once you step through it, the door itself is no longer the focus. What matters is what lies beyond. In the same way, a relic may draw attention, spark curiosity, evoke emotion. It may open a path into deeper questions about suffering, sacrifice, meaning, and truth. But if we remain fixed on the object alone, we risk missing the larger space it was meant to reveal. This is where the journey becomes more important than the conclusion. Throughout history, humans have searched for certainty, for definitive answers, for clear distinctions between what is true and what is false. But not every question yields that kind of resolution. The relics we have explored exist precisely in that unresolved space. They resist final classification. They challenge both belief and skepticism. They offer evidence, but not enough. They invite faith, but do not demand it. And in doing so, they create something rare, a sustained engagement with uncertainty. That engagement has value, because in the process of searching, we refine our understanding, we examine our assumptions, we confront the limits of what we know and the depth of what we feel. The act of seeking becomes transformative. It shapes not only what we believe, but how we believe. And perhaps that is the deeper purpose of these relics, not to provide answers, but to sustain the question. As we arrive at the end of this journey, the conclusions are not as concrete as one might expect. There is no final declaration, no definitive resolution that settles everything into place. Instead, what remains are insights, subtle but enduring. The first is this: not everything sacred can be proven. There are aspects of human experience that extend beyond measurement. Science can illuminate much, but it does not encompass all dimensions of meaning. The absence of proof does not automatically imply the absence of significance. The second is that objects may fragment, but belief does not necessarily follow the same pattern. The crown may be divided, the nails may be scattered, the shroud may be questioned, but the ideas they represent, sacrifice, endurance, connection, remain intact. In some ways, they may even become stronger as they spread, adapting to different contexts and interpretations. And the third insight is perhaps the most personal. What ultimately matters is not only what is true in an objective sense, but what is meaningful in a subjective one. This is not a rejection of truth. It is an acknowledgement that truth operates on multiple levels. There is factual truth, what can be verified. And there is existential truth, what gives life meaning. The two are not always aligned, but both shape the human experience. So the question shifts once more. Not simply, are these relics real? But, what do they mean to you? Because in the end, relics may be traces, remnants of something that may or may not be fully accessible to us. But faith, in whatever form it takes, is not a remnant. It is active, it evolves, it lives within the interpretations, the reflections, and the choices of those who engage with it. The cloth may remain silent, the thorns may be scattered, the nails may be uncertain, but the response they evoke continues. And perhaps that is where the true significance lies, not in the certainty of the object, but in the continuity of the search, not in what can be held, but in what can be understood. Because while relics may belong to the past, the meaning we draw from them exists in the present and carries forward into whatever comes next.